I like to call this chapter a sample of Jesus' intercession. And I really saw this as, obviously this is something that he prayed before he went to the cross, but I really saw this as something that he is still praying for us even now. So a lot of what I got kind of came from that, as far as just kind of getting a glimpse into his heart, what's on his heart at the right hand of the Father too. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a verse or two, and then I'm just going to make my comments. Where's my water at? I'm going to grab my water real quick. Thank you. Thunder. Okay. You got it, Liam? All right. So 17, verse 1. Are you going to read it? It's okay, I'll read it. And I am reading from New King James. Those of you that like New King James. It says, Jesus spoke these words, lifted up his eyes to heaven, and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you, as you have given him authority over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as you have given him. So, very first, starting off, Jesus lifted up his eyes to heaven. And I saw that as him giving us an example of how we are to physically acknowledge our Father in heaven, both in prayer and in worship. There's something to that. That's not a coincidence that it's recorded that here, that he lifted up his eyes. It's a sign of him lifting up his soul in prayer to the Lord, as well as having faith and expectation. Sorry. So I just saw that as kind of a model for us as well, just the importance of physically showing him that we are focused on him, that we are surrendered to him. So even Jesus himself prayed with a heart of humility that his glorification and purpose would come to pass, so that the Father's glory would be seen and known. Okay, so verse 3, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So, John 14 said that if we know Jesus, then we also know the Father. So if we know the Father, then we know Jesus. Their characters are one and the same. And again, the whole theme throughout this book has been the way to eternal life is to know Jesus. And that is where true belief begins. So just going back to that same thing, just belief, that is the way to eternal life. So one thing that stuck out to me was, why did Jesus speak in third person in these first 3 verses? Those are the only 3 verses that he spoke in third person. So I was just kind of thinking about that, like, why did he do that? And the only thing that really was highlighted to me was he did that, starting out this prayer, to highlight the unity between himself and the Father. So we can be confident that this entire prayer that Jesus is praying is in agreement with what the Father's heart is for us. So I kind of want us to keep that in mind as we go through. So he is one with the Father. So in verse 4, he says, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. So here, Jesus was praying like his mission was already complete. Even though he had not yet gone to the cross, he knew that what was going to happen was as good as done. So in verse 5, he says, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. And I think we all know that that happened after he was resurrected and after he ascended. Okay. So the next section is Jesus praying for his disciples. And I really saw this section as another model of how to pray, like I said. And Caleb mentioned last week, where's Caleb? There he is, that Jesus kind of dumped a lot of teaching on the disciples, like right before his death. And I saw this as Jesus giving us an example that we should pray to those that we preach to. And I really believe that by him praying over the disciples after all that teaching that he gave them, they received an increase in their understanding. So keep that in mind as we're reading through this.
Double check on that. You said pray to, you meant pray for.
Pray for, yes, that's what I meant. Yeah, by praying over the disciples, praying for them, they received an increase in their understanding. I don't know what I said, but that is what I meant. Okay, so verse 6 says, I have manifested your name to the men whom you have given me out of the world. They were yours, you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they have known that all things which you have given me are from you. For I have given to them the words which you have given me, and they have received them, and have known surely that I came forth from you, and they have believed that you sent me. So what he's saying in this prayer is that his mission on earth was complete because the disciples believed. And let's see. At the end of verse 6, it says, they have kept your word. So kept in the Greek, hopefully I say this right, is tereo, which comes from the root word teros, which means a watch. And it's also related to the word theoreo, which means to see or to behold. So that really stood out to me. They kept his word. And, well, we'll get more into that later because I touch back on that. But a watch, to see, and to behold, that's what that means. So, so back to chapter 16, what Caleb talked about last week. In verse 30, remember they said, now we are sure that you know all things. We talked about that a little bit. So in that moment, they acknowledged with their mouths that Jesus was the Father. But through this prayer, we can see that Jesus also saw into their hearts. They knew, or he knew, that the disciples had seen him and beheld him. And because of that, he knew that they would hold fast and keep watch for him after he left the earth. So that really stood out to me because it says that that is why he was able to complete his mission, because they had received that in their hearts. They knew in their hearts that he was who he said he was, and he knew that he could trust them to keep watch and to hold fast to him after he left. That was why he was able to complete his mission here the first time, and it's also what he's desiring to see in his bride before he returns. So verse 10. And all mine, I'm sorry, did I read verse 9? No, sorry. Verse 9. I pray for them. I do not pray for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours. And all mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I am glorified in them. So here, I actually like the New Living Translation of verse 10 because I feel like it kind of says it in a little bit different way that brings more clarity. And it says, all who are mine belong to you, and you have given them to me, so they may bring me glory. So they may bring me glory. So he has placed his glory within us because that's why he created us in the first place, to reveal his character and presence. That's what his glory is his character and his presence. He created us to reveal that to the world. So how can we do that without doing what the disciples did? Seeing and beholding and knowing him. That's what he desires for us. So that's why the time that we spend in the Word and in worship and in prayer, asking for his wisdom and discernment is critical. So he goes into this more later on in the chapter, and we'll talk about it a little more when he's praying for all the believers. So verse 11. Now I am no longer in the world, but these are in the world, and I come to you. Holy Father, keep through your name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are. So some texts in verse 11 actually say Keep them through your name that you have given me. So, Jesus, we know Jesus or Yeshua means Jehovah is salvation. So what I got from that was it's through the power of salvation and not by our own doing that we are protected and united the same way that Jesus is with the Father. I'm sorry, I'm not nervous. It's just when I talk a lot, I get out of breath. So sorry if I'm breathing really heavy in the mic. This baby. Yeah, you're right. It probably is. Maybe I should pull my hair back. I have a scrunchie in my coat pocket. Can you grab it for me? I know. I feel like there's just so much I sound disgusting. I'm sorry. It's like when Ashley talking about eating ice cream in bed, which that's totally me right now. Sitting there in bed eating ice cream. I think I probably did that yesterday. I did actually just have some of that last night. All right. Anyways, where were we? Verse 12? Okay, so verse 12 says, "While I was with them in the world, I kept them in your name. Those whom you gave me I have kept, and none of them is lost, except the son of perdition, that the scripture might be fulfilled." So, of course, the son of perdition is Judas. And the scripture that he's referring to is John 6:39. So going back to that, you don't have to turn there, but it says, "This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day." So that's saying that it's not the will of God that even one should be lost. But Judas, he made that choice. He never sought forgiveness. It didn't make God's love for Judas any less, but it's up to us to acknowledge his pursuit of us. It's up to us to acknowledge his love for us. So, verse 13, "But now I come to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." So, let's go back to, he says that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. So Jesus, clearly here, wants us to be full of joy. That still delight that we were talking about last week that John brought up. It's that knowing that there is always a treasure to be found because he's with us and he's equipped us with his word. So he is praying, even now, he prayed then, he's still praying now, that even though the world hates us and there's constant warfare and Satan is always attacking in some way, we can still be filled with joy in every circumstance because we know that we don't belong here. We know that we belong to him. We know that we belong with him. So this is our purpose. Why we're here is to be a living testimony of his goodness, as well as an instrument of conviction against the world's darkness and immorality. That was his purpose for us. So yeah, I already said, he's still interceding that for us even now. And that's really awesome to think about, that this isn't just here. I mean, he prayed this on earth, but he's still sitting at the right hand of the Father praying that for us now at this very moment. It's awesome to think about that. So I guess I want to challenge all of us. Ask yourself, do I really believe that I don't belong to this world any more than Jesus did? Do we live in that way? I know for me, when I step back and look at my life, I see that all of my troubles and stressors come from earthly mindsets or earthly things. So it's really a challenge to my faith. to think about that. I challenge you guys to think about that too. All right. So, moving on, verse 17. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And for their sakes, I sanctify myself, that they also may be sanctified by the truth. So, what I got from this was just how important it is to study and know the whole word if we want to be fully sanctified and rendered unto him, which I know we all want that. So, knowing the whole word. So he said, I have sent them into the world. After Jesus ascended, the disciples didn't just sit in their bubbles and focus on escaping their lives or avoiding confrontation and just saying, oh, I can't wait for him to come back. Like, just come back soon, Lord. Like, that's part of it, but they did more than that. They went out and they were the salt of the earth, like he said in Matthew 5. I had some extra notes here. Do you guys like my, whoever drew this, I don't know, one of my boys, I guess. Okay, so, it's okay. Somebody did. So he said, for their sakes, I sanctify myself. So that means that he gave himself as a holy sacrifice for our sakes, so that we would allow ourselves to go through that process of sanctification by his truth. So that doesn't only come from reading his word, but it comes by surrendering ourselves to that entire process of letting it sink in to our hearts. A lot of times that happens through experiences or trials. It is so important to lean on him during those experiences and trials, looking to him and looking to his word in all those circumstances. And while we're going through those trials and experiences, we can remember that he didn't just leave us here. He sent us. So we're going through that for a purpose. We're not alone. He's with us. And also, the sanctification that he had in mind for us was not just personal holiness, although that is a part of it, but the end goal is being set apart for his service. So understanding that allows us to take the focus off of ourselves and see his grace and say, you're why I'm here. I know that you have me here for your purpose. So what stuck out to me there in those last 3 verses of this part was that in what he said, he didn't say that becoming holy or becoming sanctified was a precursor to being sent. He recognized that that would be a process that we went through as we went out. So I think it's important to remember that. A lot of times we think, well, I have to prepare. I'm not good enough yet to do this. Like, I'm not ready for this. And maybe you're not, but it doesn't have to do with you not being holy enough. It has to do with your belief in what he said. So, all right. So, praying for all believers. I think that was the part that I really got the most revelation out of, was that section. Wait a second. I think I skipped a page. Yep, I did.
We're on verse
20. Sorry, guys. Oh, okay. Here we are. Okay. So, verse 20. Let's read verse 20. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. It's almost unbelievable that Jesus gave the world permission to judge his ministry based on our unity. So unity is a clear desire of Jesus here in this prayer, and it still is today. He desires unity both with himself and among all believers. And that's one reason I'm really excited that we're going to be praying with other believers and groups in our area. That's awesome. That's what he's looking for. That's what he wants from us. So, thinking back to that picture of the vine, what Caleb talked about last week, every branch that's living in union with the vine is also connected with every other branch that's doing the same thing, as long as they're connected to the vine. So I just think of that picture when I'm thinking about unity. We're all branches connected to the vine. And unity is not uniformity. Each branch might be in different stages of growth, or it might look a little different. That's okay. Paul reminded us in Ephesians 4 to be unified in love and in the Spirit. So that's the most important thing.
That's a good point, what you said about unity not being uniformity.
Yeah.
It's not looking exactly
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah.
The Spirit brings.
Right.
Say that in mic. That's good.
I forgot. That's what she said.
I don't know where the other mic is.
That's right there. It's Caleb, or somebody's supposed to
She
be
just-
on there.
You're the mic runner, man.
She was just saying unity is not uniform. She was just agreeing. Unity is not uniformity. I'm pretty sure that's all you're saying, right? Okay.
I'm saying I agree.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's not looking for us all to say the same thing the same way, or, to look the same way. It's all about our hearts being of one accord. Okay, so let's go to verse 22. Read some of that. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one, just as we are one. Yes, this is a really good part. I and them, and you and me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me, and have loved them as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory, which you have given me. For you loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you, and these have known that you sent me. And I have declared to them your name, and will declare it, that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. So, the glory which you gave me, I have given them. I really felt like that is what he's longing for us to step into right now. So, I challenge you guys this week, maybe ask him to remind you of things that we may have forgotten about what he has placed inside of us, and he will. He wants to remind us of that. I think sometimes I forget that he has given me his presence, that he's already placed his glory inside of me, and he desires for me to be a manifestation of that in the earth. And that goes for each and every one of us as believers. He's already placed that in us. So what he's desiring is unity among our hearts in worship, intercession, and love, so that the world will see the Father's love. That is why he's looking for unity in our hearts. So I really like the end of the prayer, because it's him saying that he wants us to finish the race. And he wants us to get to that place where we finally see him face to face. So remember, he's for us. He wants to pour out that continuous revelation on us of who he is. So believe that as you're going through your day-to-day, your daily walk. He's sitting there now at the right hand of the Father, saying, he's rooting for you. He's saying, I desire for you to be with me. I want you to finish this race. I am with you. So, does anybody have anything else on John 17 before we move on?
Well, I guess I could make a small comment.
Okay.
Kind of a little bit back earlier.
Green light.
Okay, there we go.
Whoops.
Where was it? Okay, back on verse 13, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves, and kind of agreeing with you that it's the joy in us, but it's also that he takes the joy in it too. So
Yeah,
he
yeah.
takes pleasure in it, and
Yeah.
it's something that he enjoys.
Yes. That's really
So
good.
it's not just us who enjoy it, but he enjoys it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because that's what it's saying, that they have my joy. He has joy. He has a joy in us. It gives him joy to do this, to be in us, to love us. Anybody else?
Okay, I have a comment. It's something the Lord has kind of been speaking to me over a period of time, and we've talked about this, how what each of us does affects each other as part of the body, and how, you know, we can't say, what have I to do with that part of the body, or how is it that something that I do is going to affect Stephen and Tiffany or Dustin and Elisa. And the Lord has kind of been challenging me with almost like this verse 19, for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they themselves may also be sanctified. To a certain extent, you know, what is that challenge to us to sanctify ourselves, that others in our body may be sanctified?
Yeah.
And that, yes, what I do or don't do really does have an effect, and really does have an important place in how we come together in unity, or how we come together to walk together in the place of power that we as a body are supposed to come together to walk in. You know, it's just been something that's been kind of an ongoing challenge to me, you know, and he may throw something in, like, it's like, what if, he'll always make it very hypothetical, but I ultimately believe it's not hypothetical. What if you doing that affects the health of Dustin and Elisa and her recovery and the way the baby is prospering or not prospering? And then it will just be, you know, this hypothetical question.
Yeah.
But he puts it in a hypothetical reality of people that I know, or of situations that I know, or like, what if I do that or I don't do that, and it affects Stephen and Tiffany's real estate business? And it'll just be these little hypothetical statements about things that I may have been praying about in the body, and he's connecting them to other things in my life.
Yeah.
Not just the fact that I pray for that,
Yeah.
but he's connecting it to other behaviors or inactivities in my life.
Well, when you think about it, he is kind of saying that here, just in the fact that, I mean, he had to do something. He had to sacrifice himself in order for us to be sanctified by the truth. And he's saying that we are one as he is with the Father. And so that makes sense that the actions that we take also affect each other. So I think that's really good.
Well, think about think about the way that the physical body works. You know, the when you hit your thumb with the hammer, everything hurts. Or when you slam your pinky toe on the corner of the wall or something, your whole body hurts in a way, not the same way as your toe does, but everything, it's just, you know, it
causes
affects
tension
the entire
in your
body.
Whole
But
body.
we,
React.
yes, everything reacts. And your hand might not know why it's reacting, but it causes this chain reaction through the entire body, and things that even affect the chemicals that the brain releases, and all of those things. But we think of it in terms of pain, but do we also think of it in terms of the food that we eat? Or we think it's easy to eat 2 pieces of cake because we don't think of what that's doing to our body, because we don't feel what it does to our body right now.
Right.
But those things affect everything. I mean, just how much we do, what we do, all of those things affect the entire body. And that's part of the problem with today's medical system, is it's treat that symptom, treat that, without dealing with the entire body, head to toe. When there's something wrong, if you have, let's say, gout in your toe, that's a symptom that there's something wrong from your head to your toe, not just something in your toe. And so it's a good way to think of, what Robin's saying, that's taking the body of Christ literally in the way that Jesus is saying that what I do affects them. He's saying what I do affects them, which means what I do affects you. What you do affects me.
Yeah, that's good. It's really good to remember. Anybody else? So, sorry, go ahead.
I was waiting for anybody else to comment on the same thing, because what I had to comment on was totally different.
Oh, okay.
Just something I ran across when reading, what was it, in verse 12, when he talks about Judas being the son of perdition. I was studying into that, and apparently that term, son of perdition, is a Hebrew idiom that means the one destined to perish.
Yes, I remember reading that too.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that really stood out to me, and I think this is because, and I may repeat myself to you guys several times because this is what God's been pounding into my head. In verse 6, Jesus says, I manifested thy name to the men whom thou gavest me. And then in 11, he says, keep them in thy name, which thou hast given me. And then in 12, I was keeping them in thy name. And then, of course, in 26, he says, and I have made known thy name to them, and they will make it known. And it all goes back, and sometimes I assume everybody knows all this stuff, but I didn't know it until a few years ago. And I'll just start at the beginning. I don't know who all was at the V when Mark had some old guy come who was a Hebrew scholar kind of a guy, and was talking about the
I think I know who you're talking about. Was he from Israel?
I don't remember where he was from, but he talked
Sean
about the
Technic.
words and all the symbols that made up
Yeah.
the words and everything. And I think this is what started me off, was he was talking about the 10 Commandments. And, that one of them is, do not take the Lord thy God's name in vain. And he said, well, what does that mean? And of course, I don't know about you all, but growing up, I was always taught that was like, don't swear using God's name, or don't say curse words and that sort of thing. That was taking God's name in vain. But actually, it has nothing to do with that. Taking God's name in vain, the word vain there means as nothing.
Yeah.
It's vanity. It's nothing. And the man who was sharing said, when you actually look into the words and the symbols that create the words and everything, what God was saying is, or the root of it was not to forget God's name.
Mm.
And I was like, well, I don't know God's name. I always called him Lord or God. What's his name?
Right.
And so from that point, God's been really just pounding in me, what is his name?
Yeah.
And whether we call it Yahweh or
Yeah.
Jehovah, again, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is because God's name is not some magical word that, ooh, if we say this name,
Right. Yeah.
there's magic powers in it or
Right.
anything. But when Moses asked God, who do I tell them sent me? Who do I say sent me? And he said, tell them I am that I am has sent you.
Yeah.
Or that can also be translated, I will be who I will be.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he tells them to say, and it's translated in our Bibles, the Lord,
Yeah.
to tell them the Lord said this, that word is, the Lord is Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
which is a different word than I am.
Yeah.
But I am, although it's spelled a little bit different, Yahweh is just, he is. And, because you wouldn't say, I am, talking to God, I am, you say, you are, or he is. And so Yahweh is, he is, or he will be.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got the understanding of he will be who he will be, that suddenly made sense to all the places in the Bible where, what we typically hear it as is like Jehovah Jireh, or Jehovah Nisi, or Jehovah Rapha. And it's, I will be your healer. I will be, or he will be my healer. He will be my protection. He will be my salvation. He will be, and suddenly his name meant something to me. That his name is who he is.
Yeah.
And then of course, I went in on the whole thing about what Jesus means.
Right.
That is, salvation, or Yahweh saves, Jehovah saves,
Yeah.
or he rescues.
Yeah.
And so, whenever we look at the name Jesus, it always bothered me because I didn't know what Jesus meant. He's like, well, it's his name. Is that some magical name or whatever? But and when you know what the name means,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
it suddenly changes
Jehovah
everything.
is salvation. Yeah, that's what it
And-
means.
And even Christ. Do we know what Christ means? What is Christ? Right, it's the anointed one. And so much, at least having grown up in the church and everything, and I don't know about you all, but it was just a Jesus Christ. It was like, this is who he is. But it didn't say anything to me until I had to really understand the name is Yahweh rescues the anointed one.
Yeah.
He's the anointed one, and why that made a difference. And every time he says, I've kept them in thy name, that you are, he's saying, I have told them that you will be whatever they need. You
Yeah.
will be their salvation. You will
Right.
be their healer. You will be their rear guard. You will be, everything that they need.
Yeah.
And so it's, because obviously, and if you go all through John, he's always talking about, Jesus is always talking about the name,
Yeah.
the name. And knowing what that name is
Mhm.
has really changed how I view God and
Mhm.
how I understand and how I relate to him.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
just, yeah, I could preach all night on that. But anyway,
Well, knowing that really, because like that never really sunk in with me either. Like Jesus manifesting his name and actually making the connection of what does Jesus' name mean, and realizing that at this time the world didn't really know this, like they hadn't experienced this aspect of God yet. Like this was something new to them as far as him saving them, him rescuing them, him bringing grace in this way through Jesus. And I think that's part of what Jesus is saying there, like in verse 6, as far as manifesting God's name.
And then with all of that in Revelation, where they're saying who was and is to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the he will be is at the same time he was and
Yeah.
he is.
Yeah, and God
Wraps
always
it all
knew.
together.
I mean, this was always the plan
Right.
as far as Jesus coming and revealing this aspect of God, doing this, saving us. So, yeah, it goes back to that too. That's really good. And I don't think I mentioned, but as far as Judas, like, that's interesting too, what you said about, you said, I read it too, but him being the one destined for destruction. Is that right?
the one destined to perish.
Destined to perish, yeah. And I think in it's Psalm 41, David prophesied, Psalm 41:9 says, even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. So David prophesied that that would happen. So, I mean, I talked about how, Judas made that decision, and he did, but at the same time, God always knew that he was destined for destruction, like you said. So I thought that was interesting. All right. John 18 won't be as long. I don't think. Okay. Well, it's totally not totally different, but, John 17 is just a prayer, and there's a lot of deep stuff in there to get, which is totally my thing. And John 18 is an account, not just an account. It's a very important account. It's an account, but as far as the way that we go through it, it's a little different. But I really like how at the very end of John 18, it all kind of comes back around. So, I'm going to start verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So the Garden of Gethsemane doesn't say that this was the Garden of Gethsemane, but we know it is. That was a familiar place for Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus was clearly not trying to hide from Judas. He knew that Judas would easily find him. And Judas probably hoped to catch Jesus by surprise, just judging by the large group of soldiers and officers that accompanied him. He was preparing for a fight. But Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." So, going back to verse 4. Jesus had prepared his whole life for this, and he was not surprised. And one thing that I read in verse 5 and 6, where here it says, I am he, the original Greek actually just says, I am. It's translated just, I am, not I am he. So him saying, I am, was also him proclaiming his divinity. And the interesting thing was his name alone took away their ability to physically stand against him. So it shows that he was clearly in control of the situation. And I think they eventually figured that out, that they were not in control of the situation. But, well, I'll get to that later. So I also read in most of the sources that I saw that the army was at least 200 people, and probably a lot more than that, but at least 200 people. Yeah. I read different things different places, but I knew it was in the hundreds at least. So thinking about that, because I know for me, like when I always thought about this scene, I never thought about it being that massive of an army that was coming against him.
Probably didn't know who was with you, so if you were people,
Yeah.
it could get pretty ugly pretty fast.
Right. Yeah, it's true. So, but he did not have to go with them. And I think, like I said, I think at some point they realized that. So he said in verse 8, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. So he said and did that. He surrendered to them in order to protect his disciples. And that's just an example of his sacrificial love, just one example. And he said, of those whom you gave me, or it says, yeah, it was the saying that was fulfilled, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. And that's said in both chapter 6 and in the chapter we just read, in chapter 17. Let's see, there's something else I was going to say about that. Well, so the next part's about Peter, and this makes a lot more sense when you think about his reaction to this huge army. So verse 10 says, Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? So I was talking with Liam about this part earlier this week and asking him, like, why do you think Peter cut off the guy's ear? And Liam was like, well, it had to have been an accident. And I was like, no. But then I got to thinking about it, like, I don't know, if you guys have any insight on this, I tried to kind of research some of it, but why did he cut off his ear? Like, what was he actually trying to do? Was he trying to behead him? Or was there a purpose in it being his ear? I don't know. You guys can let me know what you think about that. Right. So, I don't know. I thought that was...
I think it's interesting because I think Peter was probably very good with his sword. And I don't think, I highly doubt, in my opinion, that it was an accident
Yeah.
because to cut off an ear, you have
That's kind of what I think, too. Like, you have to have good aim to get just an ear.
And then it doesn't say that it went into his shoulder.
Yeah.
Or that it went into his neck.
Yeah.
Or that, it went into, or anything like that. It
Yeah.
says he cut off his ear. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very precise cut.
And like you don't have to go down with the sword. He could have
Right.
came
Could've gone
Yeah.
up,
to.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have been like real trigger happy and just like,
And it also might have been a dodge. He might have been going for the head, but he was able to get out of the way, and they kind
But it's also interesting that Peter was the one that told Jesus, "No, Lord, you will not face death. You will not go through
Right.
this." So Jesus, and he's the one. I mean, he was gung ho. I'm going to save you from this.
Yeah.
Yet he was, Jesus. That's the second time Jesus said. The first time it was, "Get behind me, Satan." You will not go against the will of my Father. And again here, shall I not drink the cup which
Yeah.
my Father has given me? I just
Mhm.
think that's really I like Peter's. I like his
His passion.
zeal, his passion
Yeah.
for his Jesus. You know,
Mhm.
this is my Jesus.
Yeah.
But yet,
Mhm.
that can get in the way.
Right. How many times do we do that where we take matters into our own hands and say, this is what should happen. This is not right. So I'm going to go this way instead of trusting God to work out his plan.
Right.
So, yeah, that's good. So it's not mentioned here in John because John is not really, I don't feel like John is as detailed of an account as the other Gospels. But despite all of this craziness happening, Jesus did a miracle and healed the guy's ear, which you can read about that in the other Gospels.
I think what just stood out to me just now, I hadn't thought about this before, is that John, microphone mouse. So this just popped out to me when you were saying it. It names the guy that got his ear cut off.
Yeah.
And I mean, they could have known him, but this obviously was written after. You know, John's not walking around with a piece of paper like, oh, great.
Yeah, yeah.
Keeping notes right there. Oh my gosh. But what I find interesting is Jesus healed his ear.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, if your ear gets chopped off and then this guy reaches down, picks it up or touches your ear and you're healed. You know your ear was
Right,
just
yeah.
cut off. And he names him by name. I never noticed that. I would just assume that he became.
How could he not?
How could he not say
Yeah.
that guy's who he said he is? So he
Right.
probably got to know John. And probably
Yeah.
got to know Peter
That's
too.
true.
Remember when he cut my ear off?
Yeah.
Every time he sees him.
Right. That's
Can you
true.
hear me?
Yeah, that's
No,
true.
I never got that.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus performed that miracle, and they weren't all like, wow. Instead, they were like, all right, nobody saw that, let's keep going. Yeah.
Well, that's another one of the moments where they realized that they weren't in control of the situation, I'm sure. I mean, that just not consolidated. What's the word I'm looking for? Confirmed it, I guess. That confirmed it right there. Okay. So moving on to verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So this was kind of confusing, but after I studied it, I realized Annas and Caiaphas were kind of both the high priests. Caiaphas had been appointed, but Annas, his father-in-law, was still living. And according to Jewish law, the office of high priest is like carried for life. So they kind of both were in that place. And of course, Caiaphas is the one that unknowingly prophesied Jesus' death. Stephen kind of taught about that in chapter 11. So, verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. So this other disciple was probably John himself because he had connections with the high priest. So we already know that John doesn't really like to give himself away in his account. He likes to speak about himself in third person. But yeah, I read that was probably John, the other disciple there.
The one who laid at his chest.
Right. He's always the special one, in case you haven't noticed, somehow.
I'm his favorite.
Yeah. So, verse 17. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, hey, Destin, said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So here we have the first denial from Peter. And he had just embarrassed himself in the garden. Well, yeah, I would say he kind of embarrassed himself after what Jesus said to him and kind of rebuked him. But he was probably following Jesus to the house of the high priest in order to establish his loyalty, and be a hero somehow. which he continues to try a couple times. But when it came down to it, he utterly failed. So that's just something to keep in mind as we kind of keep going through the story of Peter.
It's like, you know, I guess in this case, if this was John, that was the other disciple mentioned. You know, John was obviously with Jesus when he went into the court,
Right.
and then John comes back out, talks to the gatekeeper, and gets this guy in. It's like, who else would John be putting in here? You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
Right.
how obvious can you be that he's a disciple? you
Right.
know?
Yeah, and yet he still,
Yeah.
like, yeah, it was probably obvious, but he was still so afraid he
Yeah.
denied it.
I mean, he's standing there probably there's a large group of troops there who are armed, and
Hmm.
he probably doesn't. He's
Yeah.
probably a little bit scared of that too.
Like late at night or in the middle of the night, like,
This was late at night, yeah.
so, you know, there wasn't a lot of people out, you know, just roaming the streets.
Not Vegas.
No, not Vegas.
Yeah.
The city's nice, so.
And then he's also there standing shoulder to shoulder with them around the fire too. So
Right.
it's like there's not much space here. You know.
No.
Sit down. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Peter and all of that here later on.
I-
Go ahead.
Okay, this is, I guess, going to show how little I've paid attention to the Gospels. Literally, I had never noticed that John had gone in with Jesus. And it's like, I never remembered that. I mean, I always heard about Peter, and it's kind of like Peter was kind of sneaking around. And,
Right, yeah.
And I'd always, or at least had always been taught that everybody had left and deserted Jesus, and nobody went with him. And it's like, hold it. Here's this disciple who actually
Yeah.
went in with him.
And he had influence to let him in.
And was then, coming back and getting Peter and bringing him in there, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
I had never seen this before. So anyway.
Yeah. I really had never seen that either. And I think it's because it doesn't name him by name, so we just kind of gloss over it. Like,
Well,
But-
and I mean, the other disciple who was known to the high priest, so he wasn't just known to the priest that ministered in the outer court, he was known to the high priest. So that's a pretty influential place.
Right.
But he went out, spoke to her who kept the door, because Peter wouldn't have been allowed in. So John was saying, hey, I think he was saying, let him in so he can get warm by the fire. It's cold
Yeah.
out. Let him in so he can come warm by the fire. I know this guy. And I can just imagine Peter kind of like, no, I know him, but I don't know Jesus. It just kind of like that fearful place, but at the same time, he knew what Jesus had said about him too, that you're going to deny me. But in his mind, he probably wasn't denying Christ. He probably didn't think, I'm denying my Jesus. Jesus had told him, you're going to deny me 3 times. And so I don't think in that moment, I don't think he saw himself to that doorkeeper. I don't think he was telling the servant, no, I don't know him. I don't think he was thinking, I'm denying Christ right now. It's one of those things where it's a deception. And I find that interesting because I don't want to be deceived into denying Christ. But if Peter could, then we have to be careful in that place of, not thinking it's that Babylonian mindset that you were talking about last night, the religious things that become a part of us, where we might think, well, I'm not denying Christ, but I'm going to be a little more comfortable over here, and so anyway, I thought that was interesting, because if Peter can be deceived into denying Christ and not even think he's denying him, then I have to be careful.
Or it's I'm getting in here, getting close to Jesus, but I have to lie to survive, to do it, kind of a thing.
Yeah, in order to,
It's like,
yeah.
it was more of just
Fulfill.
he was trying to get in there and be with him. At the same time, he was afraid of what man could do to him.
Yeah, it's just like you said. I'm not for abortion. I hate it, but your silence says it all. You know what I mean? So.
it'd be interesting to read the other accounts of that, of the denials. I'm going to go back and read all of those. Okay. All right, so verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. So we're back inside now, inside the house. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. I have not said anything in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. That was a pretty bold answer that he gave. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. So what he said there was pretty bold and right. It was the truth. But they didn't like that.
I have a question maybe somebody can answer because I don't know.
Mike?
This is the high priest's father-in-law.
Right.
So why are they referring to him as the high priest and then saying, we'll send him down to the high priest?
Well, that's what she
That's
said.
what I was talking about earlier is
Oh, okay, I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
Annas was the high priest, but Caiaphas was appointed the high priest.
Okay,
But I think like Jewish custom, they saw like high priest was considered an office for life. So
Gotcha.
since he was still alive,
Like president,
yeah,
still president Obama.
yeah. I mean, I don't fully understand it, but I think like they both,
He was.
like Caiaphas was the one that carried out the things, but
He was the acting high priest.
yeah.
Gotcha.
But Annas still had authority.
Okay.
So yeah, so this was all just a pretrial hearing. And like I said, there's not a very detailed account here, but if you read like in Mark, it says that there were false witnesses gathered to testify since the religious leaders knew that they had no grounds against them. So it's interesting to go back and read through that too. All right, verse 25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself, because therefore they said to him, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him, whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So imagine how Peter felt. He was seeing Jesus being beaten and questioned, and he desperately wanted to prove his loyalty or be a hero in some way. But his fear got in the way. And, I get it. Like, the emotions of that night must have been a whirlwind. That doesn't excuse what he did, but I'm sure, and if you read in Mark 14, I think it says, after the rooster crowed, he broke down and wept. So Peter was horrified with himself. He wanted Jesus to get away from the bad guys, but he was too afraid of what would happen if he made his true identity known, which kind of made him a bad guy. So, I don't know, I just think about that. And that really just makes the forgiveness of Jesus that much more powerful when he realizes the depth of his guilt, which I'm sure he did.
Also, I think some of the other, at least when I was reading, at least when I remember the story, other things, they don't really mention that one of the people who noticed him was there at the garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he watched his relative get his ear cut off by this guy.
Right.
It's like,
I know.
it's like that's pretty, I'm sure he was feeling pretty cornered.
Yeah. And yet he still denied it. So, to me, that speaks just at the place of fear that he was at. And, he had to have realized that. He knew. In that moment, it was just a gut reaction to say, I don't know this man. But I'm sure as soon as he said it, he was like, why did I say that? What's wrong with me? And I think it's all too easy for us to identify with Peter in this way.
He probably, he could have been tried, as assaulting one of the, high priest guards too. So that probably
Yeah.
played a role into his fear factor.
Yeah. I mean, things could have happened to him. Bad things could have happened to him. So, let's see. So we tend to want to focus on other sins that seem worse than ours. But in the process, we fail to acknowledge how we're causing him pain. And I think that, like, in this moment, that's kind of what Peter, I don't know, he just wasn't thinking about that until after it happened. But he did. Like, it shows that he did acknowledge that he had caused Jesus pain. Right, yeah. So the Lord wants us to ask forgiveness. And it was Peter's repentant heart that caused Jesus to forgive him and bestow an even greater calling on him, which will, I'm not talking about that, but in chapter 22, I think, the last chapter, talks about the calling that Jesus gave Peter after all of this. I'm just fascinated by the story of Peter for some reason. So anyways, verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. Did I say that right? And it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So the hearts of Jesus' accusers were blatantly murderous, yet they were concerned with following their religious practices. That was interesting.
Well, it's also interesting that if they had just followed the practices that they should have, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. So it's actually in John 12:32 that we read what is referenced here in John 18:32. John 12:32, if you go back, Jesus talks about how he will be lifted up, which references crucifixion specifically. But the Romans could only carry out that kind of execution. The Jews had no power or authority to do that. So that's why they brought Jesus to Pilate. So, verse 33, then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" And I think that Jesus answered Pilate's question with a question. Because, I mean, obviously Jesus knew, he knows the answer to everything. But I think his answer depended on what Pilate meant. So was Pilate concerned with Jesus being a government rebel that was going to overthrow him, or was he just a religious leader? And Jesus was kind of neither of those things, but he was getting to something in asking him that. So Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." So, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and finish reading and then I'll talk a little bit. "But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover." This is Pilate. "Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Then they all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So the crowd rejects the one who could actually set them free and instead chooses one who had committed murder and led a failed rebellion, from what I read. So just Barabbas, it doesn't say a whole lot about Barabbas, but I just wonder, did he recognize what it meant for Jesus to die in his place on a cross that was probably meant for him specifically? So, going back just for a second to Pilate questioning Jesus. John doesn't go into as detailed of an account as we can find in the other Gospels, but Pilate definitely didn't see what he was expecting when Jesus was brought to him. Jesus didn't fit the description of a revolutionary or a criminal, and Pilate knew it. So Pilate had heard all he needed to hear to determine that Jesus wasn't a threat to him specifically. And him saying, "What is truth?" shows that his idea of truth didn't mesh with God's. He had his own truth that he wasn't willing to let go of. And that's something that he would have had to have let go of if he wanted to understand God's truth, which is the true truth. So a lot of people ask that question today, what is truth? Thinking that truth is based on their own experience or their own perspective. But that way of thinking denies what Jesus said in verse 37, that everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And the lack of standard of real truth in the world is what causes the lack of morality. So, going back to chapter 17, remember, we have been placed by God in the world to reveal his truth. And we do that. How do we do that? By seeing and beholding and knowing him. Yeah. And going out as the disciples did. But if we don't fully believe everything that he said in his word, then that's not going to change anything. So it can't just be, it's not just going out. We can't start with going out. It has to start with seeing and beholding and knowing him. That's where it all starts. So I just thought it was interesting that that was all brought back around in that question, what is truth? And then Jesus saying in chapter 17 that he is sending us into the world that we may be sanctified by the truth. So.
Well, in John chapter 8, Jesus says, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And
Yeah.
it's not just that the truth will set you free, but it's the truth that you know that sets you free.
Yeah.
And that's what it's that belief.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, I mean, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Mm-hmm.
And then he speaks of the Holy Spirit as the Spirit of truth.
Yeah.
You know, so again, it comes back to knowing him.
Mm-hmm. And the only way to know him is by spending that time in the Word and worshiping and asking him to reveal that wisdom to us. So there you go, guys. Anybody have anything else?
Not much of a big point, but I always read whenever,
Thank you. This is necessary. In 38, when Pilate said to him, what is truth? Like, there was no more communication between them about truth after that. So it just
Yeah.
kind of seemed to me it was more like in passing, like, truth is relative. What is truth?
Yeah, I also think he was trying to end the conversation by saying that.
Good.
Like, yeah.
So my comment's kind of odd, and it gets off the subject of truth. Does anyone else have a comment on the subject of truth?
Don't think so.
So in chapter 18, in verse 9, it says, the word might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. But in verse 17, we talk about, in verse 12, I guarded them, but not one perished, but the son of perdition. So, this is a very theoretical question. So was the son of perdition given to Jesus? Because he says, of those that thou
Yeah.
hast given to me, not one of them perished.
I thought about that too. I think that, to me, I saw the ones that were given to Jesus I mean, it kind of goes back to that God knowing, he knows what's going to happen before it happens. And the ones that God has given Jesus are those of us that choose to believe in him. So I guess no, but he could have been. Yeah.
We have to remember God being outside of time
Mm-hmm.
he has such a broader perspective
Mhm.
on free will and his sovereignty than we do. He is so big and so sovereign that he can know and orchestrate, and still we have free will.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other.
Right. Yeah.
Because his word makes that clear, that
Yeah.
that just because he knows doesn't mean that we have no choice in any matter.
Right. Yeah.
Just because he knows and he is sovereign, it doesn't mean that he is any less in control. In fact, that shows his absolute power and how big he is, that he can still orchestrate and he can know all things and be, planning and purposing, and that we still make our own choices
Mhm.
and we still, yield to him or we don't. That's what it comes down
Yeah.
to. So, he sanctifies once and for all. Hebrews 10:10, he sanctifies once and for all. Yet, are we going to yield or will we not?
Mhm.
Judas chose not to be sanctified.
Right.
And yet,
Yeah.
God had already purposed that.
Yeah.
So we have, having that perspective of God, we cannot think like he thinks. And
No.
to the fullest extent. We do have the mind of Christ, but his ways and his thoughts are so much higher.
Mhm. I used to kind of struggle with that. Like, how do we have free will and God still be, sovereign and know everything that's going to happen before it happens? But I think in studying his word and like reading stuff like this, it's just kind of opened my eyes to the beauty of that. Just the beauty of him having that ability to just like paint this perfect picture and like write this perfect story.
There are things like predestination, I think, have to be held at a distance
Mm-hmm.
and considered
Mhm.
part of God's plan.
Yeah. Yeah. But at the same time, we still have to make that choice, every day to walk with him. So, yeah.
We know we are called.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this makes that clear. Okay.
Something that I thought was cool, it's not in line with what you guys were talking about there, but in chapter 18, when it talks about Jesus and the disciples going over the brook Kidron, that really jumped out to me because I was like, I was just reading about Hezekiah and they threw all this stuff in the brook Kidron. So I was like, is that like a big, deep river? It's not. It's like
Yeah.
they just threw, it's just, like all
Yeah.
these idols sitting there with a creek running around them. But yeah, pretty much. From what I saw, I mean, you look at pictures, it's a valley, like Jerusalem's here, and it's this big valley with a brook. But I was kind of curious why that why it pointed that out. And if we look at King David, he's kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of his life.
Yeah.
And when he was betrayed by his son Absalom
Yeah.
went across the brook Kidron, and it was in the time of betrayal that he crossed the brook and went up to the Mount of Olives, same area where Jesus was praying, and he went and prayed almost the same thing as Jesus did.
Wow.
He said, basically, Lord, if you find fault in me, or if you find favor with me, do your will, have your way. And that's the same thing Jesus prayed, is have your will, like, take this cup from me, but okay, let your will be done in me.
Wow. I
And I
didn't
just
know
thought that
that.
was really awesome. I just
That's
found
really
that
cool.
today. It's like Kidron jumped out at me. I was like, why does it say that? I just thought that was really, really cool.
That's really cool.
It's the same time frame, same betrayals,
Yeah.
And what does that mean for us?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And something else, not a challenge, but just you guys, if you get time this week, read Psalm 22 with the picture of the crucifixion. Because it is like David is prophesying the crucifixion. And what's really interesting is he even talks about, it's a Psalm of David, and he even talks about my hands and feet were pierced. And I was looking into that. Crucifixion was not invented in David's time. It was not a thing. The Persians came up with it, and the Romans adapted it. So, anyways, so read Psalm 22 and think of that. It's cool.
Not as deep as what Nate shared about the Brook Kidron, but the word that's translated in y'all's versions, brook, is actually, well, in some versions it's translated ravine, but it's literally, it means the winter torrent. So basically it's a dry ditch, a big deep ditch that that, you know, in the winter time, you know, you can get a rush of water down through it, but it's not denoted as a regularly running. It's more of just a dry gulch, I guess what we would call it.
Because I looked at pictures, I'm like, this doesn't look brookish to me.
Yeah.
So if that's what it was like, if it wasn't this deep river, then I can imagine that thieves would find that a very interesting place. Because think about all the gold, all of the things, all the idols that were taken out of, when Hezekiah had the priests clean out the temple. They brought all the idols out and they went and dumped them in the brook Kidron.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and I think, isn't that the same brook that they brought water to the temple from in order to purify themselves? I don't know. It's just, I keep coming back to it's a place of purifying as well. And both David and Jesus crossed over that place of purification.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Still an active brook?
It's really good.
It looked like it was little though. Anybody else?
I have a question. Am I correct in assuming that Caiaphas,
He likes being a mic runner.
you're right, Caiaphas earlier in John, it said that he had prophesied about Jesus dying,
Right.
Jesus being, not, I don't know, crucified, but
Mm-hmm.
the reason for which he was dying. So did he have belief in Jesus that he was the Son of God?
Not at that time that he prophesied it, I don't think.
He kind of got the image, if I remember properly, that Jesus had to die for Israel to be saved.
Right.
Not, and he kind of took that as he's a rebel and we need to kill him to preserve our religion.
Yeah, that's where he was coming from there.
Instead of it being the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So he,
It wasn't a redemption.
Right.
Yeah.
His death
It
was
was-
important, but it wasn't.
Right. He didn't
Yeah.
see it as redemption, which is what.
He didn't realize what he was prophesying.
Right.
He was prophesying, let's do this could be good for us.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But he didn't realize that he was prophesying that he will save
Yeah.
them.
So what I said when I taught chapter 12 was that he prophesied it, but he thought that he was going to bring the children back into the fold through religious structures, and that Jesus was in the way of that. Instead, Jesus brought them back to God a different way.
Yeah.
Better way. Yeah.
Right. That's what I was saying. He wasn't really a religious leader. Like, it's okay, I've already got one. I just think it's interesting how Jesus, clearly he's the savior of the world. Like, he's the ultimate religious leader, but like from their perspective, he wasn't a religious leader. He was like the opposite.